As I travel back in time in search of old games, I will be showcasing my newer games as well. Anything that I find instructive. In this game, I played against thealmightygebaby yesterday. He is a player that improved from beginner to 2000 in about 2 weeks. Uh, he said that he read my guide extremely thoroughly. It's my Horde chess improvement guide on the variants forums, which I will link in the description. Basically, very fast improver, but he had been slowing down his playing time and just playing periodically from time to time. So now he's 2169. I think I saw him at 2185 earlier today. But in this game, what I'm going to do is another pedagogical experiment because I'm trying to find experiment with ways to try to make these games more pedagogical when I run through them and teach the concepts. So what I'm going to do is actually split split it into groups of 10, or no, I mean 10 moves, and then I go back and explain them, and then another 10 moves and I go back and explain those. So basically, grouping by tens. So a5, d6, h5, d takes c5, b takes c5, e6, b4, e takes f5, g takes f5, g6, g4, f6, h4, bishop e7, g takes f6, knight takes f6, hg, hg, fg, rook h4, and we reach our first 10 moves, so let's go ahead and go back. Okay, a5 is signaling a strong, solid strategy, basically focusing on closing black's attack. As we know, the rook files are the easiest places to open the board because the pawns can only be defended once. So a5 prevents black from opening the queen side, basically, with a5 in the future. It's also considered the best first move, in my opinion. As a bonus, it stops black from playing the rook shuffle. So, all in all, good move. Black has three main replies here. They are h5, e6, and d6. Every other move is basically inferior. These are the three best moves. I have seen a6 played, and then if white doesn't play b6, then you take on b5. If white does play b6, then you have this extra option of h5, and then taking on g4 and shuffling the rook, actually. So let's say these four are the main moves. The best move, in my opinion, in this position is actually d6. I think it's the best because after h5, white can play d5, and after e6, it's really solid for white after either d4 or a4. I would play a4 personally. So this position with like d4 or a4 has been reached in Horde World Championship 2020 Mindhunter versus Zvenos. And in this position, Zvenos did manage to win some good games, but I still think that this play is quite risky for black, actually. I think that white has very good practical chances to build an extremely strong counterattack on the queen side while black tries to open up the king side and just doesn't quite have everything that he wants to do so. So I like d6 because after e5, black can actually play h5, and now this is an improvement. This is better for black than d5, e6, because all he has to do now is take on e5 and play e6, 97, and depending on white's play, he will either infiltrate the kingside or he will liquidate the center. If white expands in the center, then usually he has too strong of a counterattack, so black then has to target the center. Otherwise, this is a very strong attack for black on the king side. So that's why in this position, white has two main moves. He can either take on d6 or he can play h5. All other moves are inferior. For example, d5 doesn't work very well because black takes and then plays c6. Something like, okay, so we attack the pawns, so b4, we can take, and then something like e6, we have this nice threat of taking on c5 followed by taking on a5. So something like, oh yeah, we also threaten to take d5. So let's just say he plays c4. We can then take here. And white's queen side is extremely loose. Like, he's got a lot of holes. And it's going to fall apart very quickly. This b pawn cannot be supported. He can't push any of his b pawns or a pawns very easily. So d5 just doesn't cut it. It weakens the queen side. And e5 runs into h5, and a4 is like a nothing move. It just doesn't help white's position too much. Black can probably just play either e6 or h5. Both look good to me. Maybe even to take, right? Anyway, so h5 is like the main move in this position at the high level, just closing black's option of opening either the queen side or the king side, or both, I should say. In this position, you should take on c5. You can also play e6, but I like to take on c5 because when you initiate a trade, you basically mold the pawn structure however you like, kind of like you are molding, I don't know, wet ceramic or something. You're trying to mold its shape. This is a very good technique for either color to employ, because if you can mold the structure to a certain way, then you will be able to force create advantages of your position. Like, you will have inherently good prospects if you can force certain types of play from the opponent. So he has two options of which way to recapture. I discussed with thealmightygebaby which way is the best way, or which way he thought was best. He says he experiments with both recaptures. On one hand, taking away from the center is very solid. It establishes a firm queenside asset for a future attack, a future counterattack on the queen side. On the other hand, b takes c5 creates you more center pawns, and then you can try to really advance the center. And the queen side is not too weak. Yeah, not really too weak. But I think d takes c5 is better. I think b takes c5 makes it take longer to create a queenside counterattacking asset, because some of your pawns will just be behind in the game by the time that black opens up the king side. So b takes c5, e6. It's just a plan for black to rip open the king side, so we just take and then play g6. Had white taken with the d pawn, there's this extra line, so e6, d4, take, e takes f5, c6, and something like e4, we can just play b6, and then a6, bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, harass this c-pawn, trade everything off, this queen comes here, bring the knight, and infiltrate the queen side. This plan is less effective if white plays the b takes c5 capture as he did in the game. Yeah, this c6 b6 thing doesn't work as well. So I play a better plan with g6. G6 can also be played if white took away from the center with d takes c5. So g6 is the plan I recommend in this position always. Threatening h5 in this case, threatening f5. If he takes back with the e pawn, which he probably should, I can do the same. I recommend g6 as a universal plan. Universal plan is just d6 take, e6 take, and then g6, assuming that white puts his pawns on h5 and a5. So this happens, I take, and let's explore the subtleties of g6. So g4, very natural, and f6, okay? After this, white's kingside suddenly looks very loose because I will definitely be able to take on g5 if I want. He can't stop that. So you have to think, is there any other idea for white in this position? One idea I would probably suggest for white is to take twice on g6, because if black takes on g6, then white has a very solid kingside. It's very hard to break this open. I mean, you have to get your queen and rook battery set up, and then you need some sort of minor piece to add extra attack to h4, or maybe to try to overload on the g5 square by bringing your knight to h7 and bishop on e7. It takes a long time. In the meantime, white will build a very strong counterattack. Black will have misplaced his queenside pieces. It takes a lot of time for this queen to get behind, although in this position you can do it right away, I guess. So in this position, it's actually best for black to play f6. So it's kind of like a temporary gambit. We just want to harass the g5 pawn. And if white supports the g5 pawn, we just simply play bishop e7. We will take 3 times on g5, pick up this pawn, form the queen-rook battery. If white plays h4, no problem. We can just probably, if we really need to, we can bring this knight here. Otherwise, we can probably bring our knight here, and if he pushes h5, we bring our knight back and take on h5. Very good plan for black, but it's hard to suggest what white should then play instead. So he tries g4, f6, h4, bishop e7. So it's very clear what I'm doing. I'm ripping open the king side, and he takes on g6. The problem with his play is that I can infiltrate the king side without having to sacrifice any minor pieces. I have 4 minor pieces, and all I need to do is bring my queen from behind, and I can simply get behind just by sacrificing the rook. White should always try to force black to sacrifice some material before he can break through. So hard to suggest what is best, but maybe something like g3 can sometimes be tried, and then if I take here, you just play g5, making it much harder. I would probably take here because after g5, it's looking better for black. So yeah, it's a hard position for white. I'm not sure how to resist here. if I'm playing white in this position, which I wouldn't have in the first place, I might even consider something like just h6 maybe, just to delay the assault on the king side. But ultimately it's not sufficient. I mean, white's king side is still really loose. He can already take and take. I mean, things are falling apart. I actually can't think of a good suggestion. So take, and now we reach move 11 after h3. Okay, the rest of this game will take much shorter to explain because it's just execution of a plan. So king f8, e5, knight df7, f5, king g7, e4, queen h8, f4, rook takes h3, g takes h3, queen takes h3, f3, queen takes h1, d5, queen takes g1, d6, c takes d6, c takes d6, and bishop d8. 20 moves, so let's go back to move 10. So rook h4, h3, king f8. The point of king f8 is to free the back rank for the queen to get from behind. Also, I recognize that the king will stay very stable on g7 because white's h-pawns will all be eradicated, so king on g7 is very safe and doing a very good role of stopping white's g-pawn. Anytime white tries to advance like the f-pawns, I just take on g6 and get a really good defensive stance. So I just think about, where does my king belong? I have to move it somewhere if I want to free the queen. So one choice is to bring the king to the queen side, and then the other is to bring the king here. Obviously, bringing the king here is better because somebody needs to watch these pawns, and the king does a really good job, thanks to the h-file being completely cleared up. So it's always good to try to keep the material in such a case. I don't have to. I can just play king g7. It's probably winning easily. But I prefer to keep material just to really demonstrate, hey, you haven't caused me to sacrifice any material. How can you ever think to win this? Just completely killing white's potential to attack because I have so much defensive material. f5, king g7, the f6 fork is just weakening for him. He should try to keep the fire alive. e4, queen h8, f4, all straightforward, take. White was already busted. Okay, d5, take on g1. And as I was discussing, this king sits very well here because white can't advance the f-pawns without giving away the g-pawns. So d6, it's always a good idea to take when you're defending. Once again, kind of molding the pawn structure, forcing it to be a certain way so that you have complete control of your information. So c takes d6, take, bishop d8. Okay, we reached move 20. Let's go through the next 10 moves. c5, knight f8, d4, queen takes f1, d5, queen takes e1, c6, bc6, bc6, queen d1, c7, take, dc7, knight a6, d6, queen e2, e6, and bishop e6, fe6, knight e6, and we reach move 31 after f5. Not much to explain here. So white's attack should be based on the queen side, but it's not fast enough, so especially because I keep all my material. So I just try to control everything, particularly the light square complex. Just very good defensive stance, because I can take as many pawns as I want. So c6, again, I take because it's a good idea to mold the pawn structure in a forced way. bc6, queen d1, c7. Yeah, this is no problem for me. Now, at least after d6, I can basically maximize my control of the light squares, because he pushed d6 to defend the c7 pawn. Not much to talk about at this point. Basically, once I collect these pawns and these pawns, everything is over. He will be left with 4 pawn island with not too many pawns versus a queen, a knight, a rook, and a king, and a pawn. That's just too much. So f5 and then take twice on c7, d4, take all these pawns, and nothing to talk about. It's over. I'm just going to finish through the last moves and then discuss how I got such a winning position in the first place. Alright, so white resigns here because I can easily collect all these pawns. So just to recap, number 1, in this opening with a5, I do like d6. I would recommend that you choose one of these 3 moves. A lot of strong players like e6 better than d6. E6 is also very good. But d6 take, basically, I recommend this universal plan with g6 against the a5 h5 system. Starting with the d6 taking on c5, e6 taking on f5. Number 2, and then of course this battery. Number 2, well, it's good to keep all your material so that you have such a strong defensive stance that white can't even advance without losing his material. Basically, it's like only something to worry about if you take a long time to infiltrate. And indeed, infiltrating the king side always takes longer than infiltrating the queen side. So you have to think about how much material do you need to leave for the defense. Number 3 would be to always consider a move if it's a trade. Always consider trades, because when you initiate the trade from either color, either side, it basically means that you're forcing a particular structure to be chosen by them. Like, they can't choose the structure, they just have to play the pawn structure that you force them to play. That way you have complete control of your information, because it's very clear what the future of the structure will become. So you don't have to worry about as many dynamic factors, and then you can just employ the strategic methods. Final takeaway, well, I guess just, I don't know. Basically, I think it's very important to know about that one cool idea after taking twice and then refusing to take here, rather playing f6 instead, being a much stronger choice for black. Conversely, you can also take with the f pawn instead of with the h pawn, and then after he takes, you can play h6. Same basic idea. You just play bishop e7 and overload the g5 pawn. So, I liked to show this game because it's a very mainline type of position. It's a type of position which you would see at the highest level. So what they would probably do is take away from the center, and then something like this happens. They take, you take, and then you play f6, and then you can assault the kingside, but it's a game. Alright, I hope this helped, and feel free to give whatever feedback you want. I mean, just as long as it's honest. I hope this helped. Thank you. Take care.